I recently finished writing my first book. It's called How to Build a Digital Assistant Without Wasting Your Time. This book took me about 3-4 months to write and illustrate, and it's a fairly technical book. What I mean by this is that it's basically a handbook or like a guide of some sorts on how to build your own digital assistant. As you can see from a lot of this, there's quite a bit of code. And so a lot of the writing process is actually explaining scripts that I have written. I've laid out an entire section from my Zettelkasten on the table here. And this is my AGI branch, Artificial General Intelligence branch, which there are some cards from in here, specifically these ones up here, that there's actually one of these that made its way into my book, but a lot of them are just doodles and designing things. And I wanted to show you how I went about writing this so that you can get a better idea if you're making something similar. I will say right off the bat, a lot of the cards here are not actually cards that I ended up using for this book. The large majority of them I actually did not use for this book. The truth is, only a few cards I actually used, specifically these ones, as I mentioned. Here's the first sketch of my assistant that I made. And this is actually, I posted this on a video, I think, titled What I'm Doing on My Gap Year. And this is basically the goal for my entire gap year. I want to implement this entire thing. Here's a later sketch which is slightly more educated based on the research that I did here, but it's still just a sketch. And this card actually ended up being in the book. Here's another version where it's just a list of things that are like a sequence of ways that I would go about doing something. Here's another sketch. Here are some thoughts about the difference between AGI and personal assistants and the domains of digital assistant development and more on digital assistant basics. So anyways, out of this entire branch, only a few of the cards were actually used to write this book, and they weren't actually used for writing. They were used to figure out the process or what I was actually developing. The next thing I'm going to show you is, I think, something a lot of people overlook when they're getting into a Zettelkasten. What that is that one of the most important parts of Zettelkasten is the actual output that you produce. Here's the first draft that I wrote of the final guide. And this is crazy to look back at now, but just flipping through this was all written by hand. This was my first draft. There's a sketch in here of what I wanted things to look like. And then I start getting into code and I start writing out the different code snippets. This was basically my first draft. And this is where a lot of the ideas started to take place. For some reason, your brain thinks differently when you're writing the draft than when you're writing the note. Even if you're writing the notes as if they will become your draft, your brain thinks of it differently, which is why I always recommend having a project in mind when you're using a Zettelkasten, because then you'll be able to take notes for that project. A lot of these notes that I took were just random notes that I wanted to know about. They weren't directed at a project. And so they still haven't really been used. Whereas the notes up there, they were made specifically for this. So you need to write drafts. The drafts are literally where the ideas piece themselves together. If your Zettelkasten is like a collection of ideas, and even if you begin making your links and you're writing down the different addresses across the cards and linking them together with different hop links across, it's when you actually sit down and write your draft that they come together. The second part, which took me a really long time, is the editing process. After having written the draft, I put it in my computer and printed it out. And I went through, and as you can see from a lot of these corrections, basically just moved a lot around, making things like just rewrite. This is not good. Or X's, just crossing things out, renaming things, going through, moving things around, crossing out entire pages. The editing step is once again crucial. Basically, you have your cards where you're collecting ideas. Then you write your draft to connect those ideas instead of collecting them and to form a unified theory. And then you begin editing to make your communication as effective as possible in your writing. And so I think I went through 4 versions. Here already you can see there were a lot less edits. I was basically just going through. I forget exactly what I was looking for on version 2. I think it might have been specifically typos, things like that, but there are very few edits there. In version 3, I was rewriting sentences I didn't like. As you can see, I did this quite a bit. added all the code snippets back in. I think I took a lot of them out in version 2, still rewriting sentences. And even at this point, adding pages. I don't know if you see here, page 14. This one's page 14a. This is all written. And then we move on to page 15. Version 4, I'm once again adding footnotes, making minor corrections. Still adding some pages in, page 4a here. But the amount of corrections are minor at this point. And then once all of this text was ready, then I spent another month manually designing every single page of this guide. And so, to recap, to build your output, there are basically 3 stages. There's the note phase, the draft phase, and the editing phase. The note phase, you are collecting ideas. You are being selective about the ideas you are collecting, and you want to apply them to the specific project or output that you're thinking of producing. In your draft phase, your job is to just word vomit and string these ideas together into some sort of cohesive theory. And in the editing phase, your job is to make the communication as clear and as effective as possible in order to get your message across to more people more effectively in an informative and entertaining way. And so that's it for this video. As I mentioned, my book is launching January 14th. The first link in the description is to sign up to my mailing list so you can get notified of when that happens. If you have any questions, post them in the comments and I'll do my best to respond to all of them. Thanks for watching and stay tuned. Lots of big things are coming up.